Hello. Today we will be telling you about our transmedia storytelling campaign called Tears of Refugees. The Tears of Refugee campaigns essentially crowdsources stories from the audience. We're doing this because we know that there are incredible stories out there, real lived ones, but there aren't many places that help display people's stories in a fashion that creates a story world. So if our stories will come from the audience, we have to be very careful selecting our audience. Luckily, we have the perfect audience right here. We've chosen students at UOWD. The reason why is important because almost everyone here comes from a country who has faced some sort of a refugee crisis. This means that our stories will be deeply impactful for them and they will most likely have stories that they can share with us. Additionally, we can target them easier with the UOWD hashtag.
For now, we have Instagram, Twitter, and a blog of our chosen platforms. Our blog serves to provide the most detailed and thorough story experience, and our Instagram and Twitter are really there to drive traffic to the blog and serve as a portal for our audience to contact us so we can share their stories. The result of this, hopefully, would be to create an anthology of sorts. With real stories from our community, we will use our platforms to share these people's stories, whether it be via a written article, a tweet, Instagram post, or a video that we create for them. The result of this will create a story world for our audience, one where they can tap in and see what happens. Each story will serve as a standalone entry point, but will provide context surrounding the story, inviting the audience to delve deeper and see what else there is.
So here is our premiere story, the story of Babak, who escaped Iran in 1980 and fled to Los Angeles as a refugee. So let's set the scene. The year is 1979, and the Shah, the monarchical ruler of Iran, was overthrown. Now, the Shah was a puppet for countries such as the UK, US, and France because he was handing Iran's oil over to them. This was the start of BP, British Petroleum Company, by the way. The revolution changed that, though. And now Western powers wanted access to Iranian oil again. So they gave Iraq a bunch of guns, tanks, bombs, and money and said, fire away. This was the start of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. With the start of the war, Babak was subject to a mandatory draft. This draft, however, was slightly more terrifying than a usual wartime draft. The Iranian army was using a tactic called human wave attacks, which meant they would send hordes of people, most often their weakest and least valuable soldiers like children, running at the opposition to clear minefields and breach the defense. This is known to be an effective tactic, with its only downside being that it requires a lot of people, most of which will die. This is what Babak would have been doing had he been drafted. Babak's uncle was a surgeon who had now become an army doctor, and he pleaded to Babak's mother and father to never let him join, for he had seen the atrocities and couldn't bear to witness his own family joining. So Babak's father, Karim, knew he had to find a way. Unfortunately, fleeing the country via land borders wasn't viable, because most borders were closed by the army, so if he got caught trying to leave, he would be drafted. The only other option was to be exempted from the draft. Exemptions were only provided under specific circumstances, such as a medical disability. Luckily, his family found a look-alike who had a disability which was an exceptionally small bladder. His family bribed the look-alike to go to the army's medical examiner and pretend to be Babak. Unfortunately, the look-alike didn't look that alike, so there was a chance of them being caught, so the bribe was very costly. Babak said that his parents never told him how much they paid, but he knows that it was most of their savings. And so the exemption was granted, and Babak was on the first flight to Los Angeles his family could book at the ripe age of 17. He said he had $150 worth of toman, but upon arriving, the exchanges didn't accept toman, so he was completely broke. He didn't speak English either. He stayed in homeless shelters and worked any jobs he could find for spare cash, for food, and to call his family via payphone. There was also a hostage crisis happening in Iran during this time, which led to extreme hostility towards Persians and potential risk of deportation. Luckily, he found solace in the already established community of Persian refugees in Van Nuys, many of whom fled during the revolution. His first full-time job was provided to him by a Persian restaurant owner, and his first landlord was also a Persian who provided him housing at a steeply discounted price. After that, he started learning English from other Iranians and eventually started using public libraries to educate himself. From 1981 to 1983, he worked constantly, and with the help of the Persian community, he got a bank account, driver's license, spoke English fluently, had a social security number, and was on his way to becoming a naturalized citizen.
He said the worst part all of this was being separated from his family. He wanted to be with them, and he could barely talk to them. He said for the first 6 months he only called them 3 times, because that's all he could afford on the payphone. Even then, he was going hungry some weekends to save money for the payphone calls. From March 22 to April 8, 1985, Iraq started bombing major Iranian cities, including Shiraz and Tehran. His eldest sister was in Tehran studying to become a doctor, while the rest of his family was still in Shiraz. Zainat, Babak's sister, said she remembers hearing sirens go off, which meant in air raids was happening. Zainat's mother, father, and two younger sisters would go inside their basement and hide whilst feeling the ground shake. She says she remembers wondering what buildings would be destroyed if her university would still be there, and which of her friends would still be alive. Meanwhile, Babak was in California, still alone and struggling for weeks without hearing from his family. He knew air raids were happening and he wanted to return, but his father was adamant he would stay there so he could later help them immigrate.
Fortunately, this story has a happy ending. Eventually, Babak enrolled at UC Berkeley as a civil engineer and graduated as the salutatorian. He eventually got a green card for his two youngest sisters and brought them over by 1988, the year the war ended. By this time, he was a very successful civil engineer working on government contract, so he was able to support his two younger siblings and eventually his father and mother. Hope you enjoyed our premiere story. Reach out to us if you have any stories you'd like to share and have a nice day.